whereby nonprofits play a significant role managing the people and places of the city, distributing social welfare goods and services, and implementing policy. And so I'm going to argue today, as I do in the book, that we have to understand the contemporary landscape as a response by white policymakers at the local and the federal level to demands for inclusion by Black and Latinx residents. And while there's lots of cheer about the entry of neighborhood-based organizations into local governance, right, it makes governance more diverse, more decentralized, and more participatory, it's also helped perpetuate racial and economic inequalities and funneled democratic rights through private organizations. So put simply, when we think about the history of the nonprofit sector, this is also a history of public policy and politics and a history of race and racism. And these stories cannot be disentangled. Before I get into what I wrote in nonprofit neighborhoods, I want to speak briefly about why I wrote this book. I think research speaks to scholarly debates, but we're all humans who are interested in questions, and I think sort of naming why we study what we do is important. And my first job after college was at the Boston Foundation. I worked as a program assistant on the housing and civic engagement dockets, and I actually worked on the Fairmount Corridor, which Jeremy is going to speak about. I left my job like 2 months before Jeremy started his field work. And one of the last meetings I attended while working at TBF was convened by two elder statesmen of the Boston community, Mel King and Hubie Jones. And they gathered a group of local leaders to share some research by a Tufts professor, James Jennings, on the status of Boston neighborhoods and its nonprofit sector. And so Dr. Jennings shared a series of maps at this meeting that have fascinated me ever since. He designed what he called a composite distress score, a metric that blended social and economic indicators, foreclosure rates, numbers of families in poverty. And so he mapped neighborhood distress in Boston. Then he mapped some demographic data of the racial segregation of the city. And then he mapped all the nonprofit organizations. And what he found was that the areas of highest distress were also home to the majority of nonprofit organizations and were home to racially segregated neighborhoods. And so we can think right intellectually about this co-location of need and nonprofits as a story of success. We could tell a story of failure, right? And the people who are at that meeting were sort of debating, what do we do with this information? But this actually inspired a set of historical questions for me, right? The organizations that Jennings founded or talked about were founded when Mel King and Hubie Jones were young men, right? This is them in 1968 at a Black Solidarity Day event in Roxbury. And so there was this temporal variable lacking in what Jennings was talking about because the patterns had persisted for decades despite really important work. So my book and my research more broadly sort of reflect my wrestling with this set of questions that Jennings sort of put on the table, perhaps unknowingly that I would pick them up. And so my work grapples with this reality that instead of solving problems in our midst with nonprofit organizations, we found new ways of managing them. And this isn't to demonize nonprofits or undermine their work. On the contrary, right? I want to sort of emphasize that their limitations are a feature and not a bug of urban governance, and to root their inadequacy to really get at structural problems in a continuing pattern of racial exclusion. So with that introduction, I'm going to walk you briefly through some of my book. It has 7 chapters. It opens in the 1950s. I'm a historian, so it's organized chronologically. And it begins amid urban renewal and the sense of urban crisis. And it frames post-war American history through a story of Boston, right? So this is a local story, which makes it particularly fun to be here today, which I argue Boston sort of foreshadowed and reflected national trends. And my focus on Boston had some pragmatic and methodological underpinnings. I did my graduate work at Harvard, which meant I could access archives at Northeastern University, which has a particularly robust collection of organizational papers. And I paired those with Boston, it's familiar, with some local government collections, including at the Boston Public Library, because I was interested in how money and influence was moving between government and nonprofit organizations. So this meant that I looked at nonprofit budgets, letters, memos, programmatic reports, right? This is sort of what my data looks like. And so Boston, like most cities in the 1950s and 60s, faced a slew of challenges, right? Here, as elsewhere, linked processes of deindustrialization, suburbanization, and white flight simultaneously increased need in urban neighborhoods and decreased the ability and willingness of municipalities to respond. And so our local version of these sort of national trends, I think, is embodied by the construction of Route 128, very familiar highway to this audience. It was known at the time, sometimes called the Golden Road, and sometimes called the Road to Segregation. And these two monikers, I think, capture the public investment that went into building 128 and the ways that private wealth amassed around it, and the ways in which the amassing of that prosperity along the suburban ring was highly restricted, right, through mortgages, financing, zoning, and other mechanisms of exclusion to white families, right? So we see this legacy in Boston today. This meant that Boston lost much of its tax base with a crumbling housing stock and became characterized by deep municipal and regional segregation. This map from the 1960s captures what was sometimes called the Black Boomerang, where these segregated census tracts were home to 70% of Black Bostonians. And so Boston was becoming poor in a vicious cycle, and that poverty carried a racial dimension. So this is a familiar and widespread story. Also familiar is how the government responded, right? The story of urban renewal during the 1950s and 60s targeted the so-called slums with a combination of bulldozing and construction that have had well-documented consequences of displacement, removal, and warehousing of poor people, particularly people of color. And early renewal efforts in Boston, most famously in the West End on the left, but also in the New York Streets neighborhood on the right, received significant pushback. And while that pushback wasn't enough to stop either of these projects from just demolishing entire neighborhoods that were home to families, it sort of threatened future renewal projects in Boston. And so newly elected Mayor Collins, he'd run politically on this campaign to, quote, plan with the people. And he hired Ed Logue from New Haven as his renewal czar to reset the project of renewal in the city. And so to manage local protest and comply with the sort of very limited federal expectations of local participation, the Federal Housing and Home Finance Administration had encouraged municipalities to partner with local nonprofits, since it was seen that these organizations could play a, quote, key role in interpreting the program to neighborhood families with whom they have a relationship, right? Nonprofits carry this sense of trust and authenticity, true or not. Jeremy's going to talk more about that, but there's this reputation, right? And so Logue follows this tactic and extends a grant and contracts to promote urban renewal and manage participation, right? Solicit neighborhood input, to a couple of local nonprofits. He does this in Washington Park and Charlestown, and this was particularly valuable, Logue learned, in winning the support of the Black community in Washington Park, and responding to their initial anger at actually having been excluded from urban renewal. Because before urban renewal gained the sort of nickname from James Baldwin of Negro removal, Black residents in Boston saw renewal as a potentially good thing. This was something you wanted because it was federal investment in your neighborhood. And so Otto Snowden, who with his wife had founded Roxbury's Freedom House, when Washington Park was excluded, Otto Snowden sent a telegram to the mayor saying, "We cannot understand this bypassing unless it's a matter of racial discrimination." Logue wrote back, "Give me a chance." And so begins this new role for Freedom House as this private space of public inclusion. And so Freedom House had had a reputation as a leading civil rights entity in Roxbury, known for its commitment to principles of integration, middle-class uplift, and home ownership. And Loeb, he was a smart man, right? He kept these aspects in mind when he extended a contract to Freedom House. And the BRA, the Redevelopment Authority, had signed similar agreements with other nonprofits in Boston to manage the relocation of urban renewal. But Freedom House, this one, transferred far more authority and responsibility for planning and ratifying neighborhood plans to a nonprofit for implementation. It's a roughly $30,000 contract in the early 1960s. This enables Freedom House to hire a lot more staff, including 5 Black women from the neighborhood to manage these processes. And here we see Muriel Snowden standing over the mayor, Ed Loeb holding the ruler, and other members of the BRA. And Freedom House itself was transformed, right, by the presence of these giant maps. They opened their offices for extended hours before and after business. And they brought in neighborhood residents to critique, comment, engage with these very public documents, and contribute to the future design of the neighborhood. And so after all these community meetings, Freedom House delivered a positive vote saying yes to the city and yes to the federal government to unlock federal renewal spending in Washington Park. This was not an easy or smooth process by any means. Neighborhood residents resisted a lot of what was going on. They voted against some affordable housing. The BRA and Freedom House did not have an easy relationship, and many of the buildings that were promised never actually got built. But there's this veneer that this is a success story. Everyone's telling themselves that this actually works. And so Freedom House itself and the city of Boston really amplifies this story as one of success. And reason, right? Freedom House had amplified the voices of Black residents when there were few ways in which they could do so in city government. So it's sort of celebrated at Freedom House as this vehicle for participation that has sort of exceeded its reality. But it was a narrative, so oh, here we have the community meetings, but there are academic journal articles. The National Association of City Planners comes and visits Freedom House, right? This story narrative is getting built, that this is a success story, and that you can manage democratic processes of citizen participation, policy implementation, community representation through a nonprofit organization. City gets to look really responsive, right? This looks great for the Collins administration, but they also get to abdicate some of the responsibility and maintain the power of selecting who the neighborhood partner actually was. And so this pattern keeps continuing, and it becomes a go-to strategy for later mayors and public leaders, particularly white mayors and white leaders, to manage local Black protests in Black neighborhoods. Another high-profile example, right? During busing in Boston, 1974, Mayor Kevin White relied on partnerships with nonprofits to manage the start of the school year. We see bus monitors from the Citywide Educational Coalition training volunteer parents. And this is a rumor control center at City Hall. The phone number for Metco is taped up on the wall. And many of these partnerships had been in place before busing actually started. Even before busing, a strike by students, Black students in 1971, the city reallocated funding through law enforcement grant programs to the Roxbury Multi-Service Center to launch a crisis response program to, quote, prevent disorder. During the 1972-73 school year, the Savmore Community Program helps manage the school dismissal program process at the King School. And these nonprofit staffers did a much better job than the Boston police, who would often show up with shotguns and dogs at the dismissal of a middle school. And so they're the city's reliance on these nonprofit organizations is doing really important work of keeping kids safe, but it's also addressing a problem of educational inequality by burdening Black residents and organizations to maintain safety when it's predominantly white teenagers and parents initiating the violence. and the ability of neighborhood groups to sort of quickly mobilize in response to busing carried a flip side, right? Things quickly built could be quickly dismantled. And so once the initial crisis ended, the mayor's office declines to renew all the grants. Citywide Educational Coalition says, okay, now we can finally get at school reform, right? Let's actually get at the roots. The city says, no, go to some private funders. We're no longer available to you. Right, so we're thinking about managing the crisis and not actually getting at the heart of it. And though I've highlighted these two sort of moments of crisis where the city relied on local nonprofits, the majority of these tools are used in pretty quotidian ways to establish precedents and relationships in the city. Under the Model Cities program, something's missing. In the 60s and 70s, the city used grants to meet the needs of the growing populations of ethnic minorities. The city contracted with La Alianza Hispana, pictured on the left here, and the Chinese Progressive Association to provide translation services, right? We can imagine in an alternate universe, the city might have actually printed their materials in other languages, but no, they pay a nonprofit to do the translation, right? There are some trade-offs happening here. And these kinds of arrangements blanketed certain neighborhoods. This is a spatial version in the South End of where grant dollars are coming in. And one of the things I like to highlight is that this governance approach is used across different issue areas. So social services, housing, participation, improving health, cleaning up parks, after school programs, they're all relying on the same mechanisms of government grants going to private nonprofits. And this reflects at the time sort of some flexibility within federal programs to enable local manipulation, but also an overriding sense in City Hall that working with neighborhood groups made for good politics and it made for good policy. During an era of declining municipal revenue, declining federal support for cities, and retreating faith in the ability of government to get things done. And these kind of assessments then reinforce in this cyclical pattern the seeming preferability of managing urban crises through partnerships with nonprofits in this sort of ongoing cycle. So far I've sort of privileged the government's perspective, why they would want to partner with a nonprofit. I'm going to spend just a final minute or so talking about why nonprofits wanted to engage in these partnerships, right? Two-way street. Because these weren't handouts, right? They were responses to calls for equity by people traditionally excluded and choices by those in power to supplement an unequal system with nonprofit services rather than address the structural underpinning beneath them. But for individual nonprofits, government grants offered a huge opportunity, right? At least theoretically for revenue, for authority, legitimacy, and capacity, and a seat at the table, which when taken together enabled organizations to meet immediate needs when the government couldn't or wouldn't. So let's consider some brief examples. Government funding enabled nonprofits to hire staff that came from the neighborhoods where people lived and where the services were being delivered. Here are women applying for jobs at a Head Start school. There's a building being constructed by the Emergency Tenants Council, Puerto Rican group in the South End with a combination of market rate loans, foundation subsidies, and government grants, and some materials from an LGBTQ serving organization as part of Healthy Boston. This is what public-private partnership looks like in action, right? But these opportunities left nonprofits really vulnerable to the whims of grant making, right? Government grants are for a very short period of time. This is hard to see, but it's a chart with a tutoring program approved in June, launched in August, and done by March. Whew, that's a rapid fire if you've ever worked on a grant or run a program, right? This is really unrealistic. Grant dollars are late to arrive, they don't cover overhead, and one beleaguered executive director wrote a city bureaucrat, "We've used ingenuity up. What's needed is more money," right? Can't innovate our way out of this. We just need the dollars. And so neighborhood-based organizations deliver valuable goods and services, but under conditions of financial precarity and organizational vulnerability. And so by design, right, grant making is a form of competition. It gives choice to those with resources and incentivizes those seeking to adapt, their funding goals, draft budgets, right? We've all participated in these processes to look good to a funder. And we might talk about the connections between nonprofits and neoliberalism later. And this put nonprofit leaders in a difficult position, right? Which they fully realize of both courting government funding and challenging government inaction on issues of poverty, racial exclusion, and rising inequality. The South End Security Program, for example, organized elderly escorts and mailbox monitors in the 1970s on the days that welfare checks were delivered at a local housing development. City grant manager denies the program's request for funding for, quote, extra programmatic activities. They've started out handing out bulk foods, macaroni, dry beans, evaporated milk. But that food program fell outside the bounds of what they were supposed to do. And so William Shabazz gets fired for his efforts to help meet community needs. His boss is sympathetic, but he says we can't run the risk of not getting our grant next year. And so there's no denying, right, that past efforts have improved the lives of many. But improving outcomes is not the same thing as eliminating causes, right? It's a simple point, but one I think that's worth emphasizing. And that doesn't make the work of neighborhood nonprofits unimportant. It makes it inadequate. And it sets the goal higher than improving odds of surviving, while also knowing that surviving isn't always guaranteed. Grassroots groups know this. This is not new information for any of the groups that I write about or are currently doing new work, but they've had reason to be careful when criticizing the public and private funders that keep them afloat. And so over the 20th century, right, the sort of takeaway message is that a diverse range of people fought to have their needs acknowledged and met through government funding of nonprofit activity. This is a remarkable achievement to recognize who lives in American cities whose needs need to be met. But nonprofits have proved a really poor counterweight against the broader shifts in the political economy of American cities. There's an inadequacy here. And so as cities continue to face profound challenges, I think we might want to interrogate the solutions we've turned to, understand their origins, and grapple with what that consequences mean moving forward. Thank you.
Let me just follow that up by agreeing with Claire that it's really great to be with you all here today. Claire and I have actually been daydreaming of an event like this for quite some time since we were in grad school, when these books were just twinkles in our respective eyes. So thank you to the organizers and staff, to our panelists for putting this whole thing together. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book, Constructing Community, which was published last year with Princeton University Press. The book is about urban governance and the politics of community development, things like affordable housing, public infrastructure, transit, community gardens, and other sorts of projects that attempt to improve the conditions of poor neighborhoods in the US. As Claire's book shows with, I would argue, exceptional clarity and insight, over the last 60 years, urban policy has come to incorporate community nonprofits into public decision-making, and has come to understand this inclusion alongside public participation and community meetings as the governance solution for how to implement the problem of community control. From this historical context, my book asks, what does community control actually look like on the ground today? Based on 4 years of fieldwork here in Boston between 2010 and 2014, I make 2 empirical arguments and 1 more theoretical takeaway. First, community control really means nonprofit control in practice. The nonprofit sector, including community-based organizations, foundations, and their many consultants, have become central players in urban governance. To put a fine point on it, the nonprofit side governs more and the legislative side governs less than what many of us might expect. And second, the second argument is that the inclusion of the nonprofit sector has unintentionally undermined democratic representation and introduced new mechanisms of inequality. Nonprofit leaders represented poor neighborhoods in politics, but were not elected into their positions. They may choose to do so, but it is not a requirement of their existence as a nonprofit. And when we come to rely so heavily on nonprofits to represent neighborhoods, as Claire's book shows the historical origins of, the absence of a neighborhood nonprofit can cut off a neighborhood's access to resources and political voice. Now, I think the easy response to all this would be to say that things would be better if we just found those true, authentic, grassroots nonprofits to represent every neighborhood. And the final takeaway of the book is to challenge this pervasive assumption. Even under the best of circumstances, with the most community-driven nonprofits, no organization or participatory process can ever fully empower the community because there is no such thing as the community. Now, this point informs the play on words in the book's title. Community development is as much about the physical construction of communities as it is about the political construction of the idea of community. Policymakers and nonprofit leaders performed their representation of the community, implicitly shifting the boundaries of membership in ways that would better support their status in the field. In short, community was not something that had agreed upon membership criteria, but was rather a symbolic vehicle of meaning to pursue certain political ends. When we appreciate this social fact, it helps us better understand that ascent of nonprofits into formal structures of urban governance, as well as some of the shortcomings of urban policy today. So like I said, this is the more theoretical takeaway from the project. So these arguments are based on fieldwork that I conducted in the Fairmount Corridor, a 9-mile rail corridor in Boston. There are 8 predominantly low-income, predominantly non-white neighborhoods alongside this corridor, connected here on this map of Boston by that thick purple line. Over the course of 4 years, I followed 62 different projects in those neighborhoods along the corridor, working inside Boston City Hall, briefly actually interning, in fact, with Mayor Wu back when she was a second-year Harvard Law student. Also observing Marvin and other nonprofit leaders in their strategy sessions, attending community meetings, and then spending a year as a consultant for the Boston Foundation. So for my time today, I want to tell you 3 stories that I think illustrate and exemplify the book's central arguments. So this is a map of the city with census block groups shaded by percent Black during the time of my fieldwork, so set at 2010 to start. So let me first tell you about a proposed urban farm in 4 Corners. On a rainy night in September 2011, there was a public community meeting held in a Boston housing project. The meeting was co-hosted by the City of Boston and the Greater 4 Corners Action Coalition led by Marvin at the time. And the topic of conversation was the conversion of this vacant city-owned lot into a small half-acre urban farm in 4 Corners. A couple dozen Black residents sat in chairs similar to this and listened to a presentation by a Black-owned company that had submitted a bid to develop the site. About 45 minutes or so into the meeting, City Councilor Charles Yancey, a 15-term Black councilor from the neighborhood, entered the room and he sat in the audience. His hand shot up as soon as the Q&A session began. He stood up from his seat and started lobbying a variety of issues he had. But the biggest one, the most fundamental concern, was the community basis of the project. The project was imposed on the community, he declared, top down. Now, as he was speaking, Marvin, and I wonder if you remember this, started walking around the perimeter of the room, and he approached Councilor Yancey from behind. He tapped the city councilor on his shoulder, and he started whispering in his ear. Now, none of us could hear this. I wonder if you're going to enlighten us. I mean, it's a long time ago. I'm curious what he said. But regardless of what was said, when he finished, Councilor Yancey abruptly sat down. I've been informed that I've overstayed my welcome, Councilor Yancey announced, in my own district. A few minutes later, after other questions had been answered, Councilor Yancey's assistant asked a follow-up about community support for the project. A Black city official responded, but he responded by deferring to Marvin. I'm not asking Marvin, the assistant retorted, I'm asking the city. The official shot back, he's part of the conversation though, because he runs the community group in the area. Excuse me, Councilor Yancey interjected, standing back up from his seat in the audience. But I represent the community and am elected, and I think that question should be answered. Marvin at this point was now standing back at the front of the room, and he thanked Councilor Yancey for his demonstrated commitment to the neighborhood. But he assured the city councilor and all the rest of us in the room who were watching that his organization would take responsibility and represent the neighborhood should any issues about the site arise. A community organizer with the Action Coalition called out from his seat, hey, let us do our jobs. The meeting ended, Councilor Yancey sat back down, the meeting ended a few minutes later, and then the following summer, that agriculture company began farming at the site. So in this scene, for all intents and purposes, it was Marvin who represented Four Corners and negotiated with the agriculture company and city officials, not the city councilor from that district. Okay, so what happens to resources and political voice when a neighborhood loses its nonprofit representative? Let me now tell you a second story about Mattapan, a neighborhood just a couple neighborhoods down from Four Corners. Here, the Mattapan Community Development Corporation, or Mattapan CDC for short, was struggling to keep the lights on. In 2011, Mattapan CDC's interim director, Michelle, tried to persuade the organization's longtime private funders to help keep the organization alive. During one meeting at the Boston Foundation, those funders told Michelle that unfortunately, no resources would be forthcoming. They said, we are in the business of funding successful projects like the ones they showcase in their annual reports, not ensuring the viability of an organization. Funding a poor-performing, low-capacity nonprofit would make them appear ineffectual as funders, and they had their own reputations at stake. They saw Mattapan CDC, a proxy for the community, as a poor investment. 6 months later, Mattapan CDC filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. This was a major blow to the neighborhood. As Boston's chief of housing told a reporter at the time, it's a big loss. Now, unlike Four Corners, where Marvin took control as the neighborhood's representative, in Mattapan, two elected politicians took the place of the nonprofit representative to try to negotiate for the neighborhood's interests. But those politicians can't accept grants and implement projects. And so several projects that were slated for the neighborhood were delayed or abandoned altogether. Other for-profit investors filled the void. This project, for instance, by a suburban-based real estate investment group, bought and rebranded a 400-apartment complex in the neighborhood. The new name, combined with immediate rent increases, caused residents to rightfully worry about pending gentrification. And so, in Mattapan, the flow of resources stopped when Mattapan CDC filed for bankruptcy and elected officials fulfilled their formal duties of representation. Okay, one last story. There was a tax foreclosed former mattress factory in Upham's Corner, a bit north of Mattapan in Four Corners, colloquially referred to as the Maxwell Building. In 2013, city officials quietly transferred ownership of the building over to the Department of Public Works. Public Works planned to demolish the abandoned building and replace it with a much-needed lighting storage facility. As these plans were unfolding, there was a parallel neighborhood planning process underway, managed by an advisory group comprised mostly of nonprofit leaders and like a handful or so of residents. Now, this group had come up with several development scenarios for the site for housing and other uses, none of which involving a lighting storage facility. On top of that, a group of low-income Cape Verdean residents who lived nearby the abandoned factory found out about the city's plans, and again, as you might imagine, were not too happy about it. Following the norms of community control in public meetings, they brought their displeasure to that advisory group during a public community meeting. The group's co-chair, Chris, who was then the interim director of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, or DSNI, at the time, was just as upset. I should note, Chris is actually back in his home state of Arkansas at the moment, currently running for governor. But before he was running for governor of Arkansas, Chris was a Boston nonprofit leader. And Chris was worried that, quote, the community process has been short-circuited in a major, major way. How loud do I need to yell on behalf of myself, and more importantly, on behalf of the community? He asked rhetorically at a meeting about the site. So the advisory group discussed the issue, and they decided to craft a letter to city officials, specifically calling attention to the role of the community in deciding the fate of the former factories. A week after that letter was sent, city officials reversed course, and they abandoned their plans for the lighting storage facility. As the head of the property disposition department at the time explained, the mayor decided there was a better use for the site. All right, a clear victory for the community. Local policymakers or city officials in this case then asked, well, okay, what does the community want instead? City government then hosted a public community meeting, and they presented some draft guidelines for a request for proposals. The idea was to have the community determine the criteria for the site. They came with a set of draft guidelines for a mixed income, mixed use project, a very broad, flexible RFP, request for proposals, about projects that were pretty common already in the neighborhood. But a board member from DSNI, who was there at the meeting, pushed city officials to let DSNI run a separate community process to come up with more community-driven development criteria on their own. City officials acquiesced, deferring to DSNI as the community representative of the neighborhood. DSNI then hosted their own public community meetings, a series of them, one of which is shown here. At this particular meeting, the lead organizer, who's there at the front of the room, divided the 30 or so of us in attendance into 3 groups. Our task was to list out everything we really wanted to see at the site and everything we really didn't want to see at the site. After 45 minutes or an hour of discussion, the recommendations that all emerged all directly contradicted each other. One resident requested a park for kids in the neighborhood to play in. Another said the neighborhood already has plenty of parks. One said we should have a light industrial facility for local jobs for local residents. Another said only housing, no commercial uses. Some said only affordable housing for the people who live here in this neighborhood now. Others said we have a concentration of poverty in this neighborhood and advocated for market rate condos alongside affordable housing or market rate altogether. As the meeting ended, city officials looked dejected with their heads in their hands. The contradictory information did not reveal any clear community priority. Reflecting that lack of consensus, the final guidelines for the request for proposals was practically indistinguishable from those officials' initial draft. It took another 2 years before a nonprofit developer was awarded final approval in 2016 for a mixed income project, bringing 89 new apartments to the neighborhood. And then it was another 5 years after that before the new development finally opened just last year. So how should we think about community control here? DSNI took control and represented the neighborhood, but the community process did not reveal a singular community position for them to elevate and juxtapose against potential developers or city government. Now, this shouldn't really be surprising. People who live in poor neighborhoods don't all think the same, even those that might share similar demographics. It's also worth noting here that the pursuit of a singular community voice unintentionally put affordable housing at risk. As the process played out over many years and many meetings, the value of land there only increased. And while a mixed income project was ultimately selected, there were additional bids for fully market rate projects, raising the specter of gentrification. So no, elevating nonprofits as community representatives and institutionalizing community participation did not lead to community control, at least in the literal sense of the phrase. But it would also be difficult to think of any process that would have yielded community control, given the understandably divergent interests and opinions at hand. So to return to the key overarching arguments from the book, nonprofit leaders like Marvin can supersede elected politicians and be viewed in the field of local policymaking as the political representatives for neighborhoods. In many ways, it's kind of similar to what Claire was saying. This is an improvement from past decades. Community organizations like Marvin's advocated for neighborhood resources and helped residents realize the potential of participation. At the same time, though, there's a cost. These non-elected neighborhood representatives are not subject formally to any formal mechanisms of democratic accountability. There's no requirement to be voted into their positions. There's no formal petition authority or veto power among people in a particular community, and so on. Resident voice is also realized to the extent it aligns with nonprofit interests and strategy, something political scientists might call democracy by coincidence. Now, this is not at all to say that I trust someone like Councillor Yancey more than I trust Marvin, just the opposite, in fact. But it nevertheless does pose some challenges, or at least gray areas, for representative democracy. And moreover, this system doesn't work well at all for neighborhoods like Mattapan. Losing its CBO, its community-based organization, meant losing resources and political voice. Foundations saw the neighborhood as a strategically risky bet, despite being obviously worthy of charitable resources. In a city like Boston, this has meant far fewer resources for the most disadvantaged and a far greater threat of gentrification. Now, again, a reasonable reaction to all of this might be to find alternative ways or different kinds of organizations to better empower the community. But in Upham's Corner, there was no singular community position. No additional meeting or clever urban planning activity would have made a difference. Community control was elusive because there was no the community. This empirical reality contradicts so much of the basic assumptions of urban policy. In practice, the implementation of community control through nonprofits and participation assumes homogeneous, self-contained communities. It requires it to even ask the question, what does the community want? If the modal answer was a lot of people want a lot of different things, it'd be a silly question to ask in the first place. But on the ground, this assumption or these assumptions of unified singular communities don't hold. There's not one, but many communities. We shouldn't interpret this, however, as a call for less participation, but rather more, just without this assumption of a singular community position. The book, of course, contains many more examples and a much deeper discussion of some proposed policy fixes. I hope you check it out if you haven't already, and I look forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you for those amazing presentations. I am so excited to be on this panel and to participate with these just three fabulous co-panelists and to hear what they have to say. So I will be brief. But these are really important work that really made me rethink what effective, equitable, and democratically responsive urban politics looks like. So both of these books really interrogate the role of nonprofits in implementing public policy. They question whether these are effective units to sort of implement these like critical functions of our urban governments. They also, more broadly, think about the role of nonprofits in urban democracy. They think about whether it's who can best represent community interests and what leads to a responsive democracy. Finally, both of these books also really highlight the huge political power of foundations. And I want to pick that up a little bit because I think this is something really, just important for thinking about, who really governs in our cities, right? So starting more specifically with Claire's book, this is like really careful, detailed historical work. I learned a lot about the city of Boston and sort of its development from the 1950s to the present day. It shows this incredibly intricate steps that have led us to a policy implementation system that I think she compellingly shows is not up to the task of tackling some of our biggest structural inequalities. She really shows how at every step, enormous political power has been granted to the people who give grants, right? And that they wield just incredible influence at every step of the way. And that this power comes at the expense of less well-represented voices in the community. And it really provides, more generally, critical historical context to how we got here today, which is where Jeremy's book takes us, right? So his book gives us a fabulous contemporary perspective, and you really get a sense of some of the in-depth ethnography that went into this work. Sometimes I had to put this book down because some of the meetings felt so unnervingly accurate. Like I was like, was I at that? I wasn't at that meeting, but it sounds like I had been at that meeting. And he really challenges our notion of who should effectively represent a community. Is it elected officials? Not really necessarily, right? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Is it nonprofit officials? Maybe, maybe not, right? And really thinking about when someone shows up at a community meeting and says, I'm here to represent the community, who do they mean? And is there even really a coherent community that we can talk about with these interests? So I think as a political scientist, it's like a really, really valuable question, because we spend all of this time talking about democratic responsiveness, but really interrogating sort of who is the community is such an important question. So some of the questions I would love to have just in the back of our heads, obviously we don't have to tackle these all, and I hope to really have more of the audience driving this, is what role should nonprofits have in urban governance? To what extent should they be implementers of important urban policies? To what extent do they politically represent the interests of marginalized communities? And what do we think is the best path forward for representing Black and Latino voices in Boston, who have been marginalized at so many turns historically? And one of the really, I think, fascinating part of Claire's book is she talks about how a lot of civil rights activists in Boston became deeply involved in the nonprofit community because they were completely excluded from very racist elected political institutions. And so really taking that history into account and thinking about what we need to do going forward to make sure that voices that are not adequately heard in our political processes are heard. And finally, the provocative question I just want to think about is, are cities actually being governed by foundations? Because that kind of felt like one of the implications of both of your books. So I'll leave us there, and I really look forward to hearing from Marvin because I know he has a really valuable perspective as a leader in our community. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but do you have a couple comments to start with, or?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. So let me say, first of all, that I do think there's a need for nonprofits, obviously. And these are areas that the government has historically not invested in or not invested well. And so to actually bring in folks who are more in touch and more in tune with what's needed, I think it's a smart move and it's a necessary move. I don't think of elected officials versus nonprofit representation. I actually think that it has to be a partnership. And though I do remember that encounter with Councilor Jansen, it was, and I'll get to this part because I think this is important as we talk about what a nonprofit organization could look like. Because in the books you really talk about democracy and stuff. But it was just reminding him that in Four Corners, we had a set of rules that govern our public meetings, and nobody controlled those meetings but Four Corners Action Coalition and its residents. There was a time when we actually were having a meeting and about a development project, and someone from the Department of Neighborhood Development, who I had not worked with before at that time, came in with an agenda and just having to run the meeting. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not how we do things here. She said, well, that's the way we always do things. So I called her boss. Her boss called her on the cell phone. I think I know, said, tell me what you want. What's the agenda? Because we made it clear to City Hall and everyone in Four Corners ran those meetings. We set the agenda. We welcomed you into our neighborhood. And that's important. That was our neighborhood. And that's what I have to remind Councilor Jansen. Yeah, you elected representative, but you're in Four Corners at one of our meetings. So you need to let us run our meeting the way we run our meeting. So he understood that, he took a seat. But the, but I think that, one of the things that I wish you had developed more in your book was the distinction between nonprofits, right? You and I were talking about this just before the meeting started, because a lot of the book centers on community development corporations, which I'm going to be very fair and transparent, let people know that I am not enamored of community development corporations, particularly the way they're run here in Massachusetts. You know, I worked for a CDC in Baltimore, and the organizing led to development. Here, the development leads to organizing. And I often don't see much difference between the nonprofit community developers and for-profit. I'm telling you, it's just blurred, the lines are blurred. And everybody, all the CDC world knows how I feel about this. I've had these conversations with all of them. We still work together, we're friends. Gail Lattimore is a very close friend of mine, but she and I just go at it all the time. I say that, you know, I don't think you shouldn't call yourself a community-based organization, right? But I think one is drawing a distinction between the different organizations. I think that as Four Corners, we tried very hard to be as democratic as possible, right? We had elections every year, and the board was made of residents. We had a couple of seats for the institutions that were in the neighborhood, from the business person, and I forgot another slot. But even when folks came to us and said, well, you know, you really need to have folks that can help with the funding and the fundraising and these expertise. And we said, yeah, but they could be on the advisory committee that can meet quarterly. But the work of the organization and the carrying out the mission has to be done by the residents. And they meet every month and in between. And so even in the case in the book where you mentioned a meeting with MBTA, and it was brought up that there had been a pre-meeting. The fact is that there was a pre-meeting about where we came up with this is what, here are the things that we are not going to give up. Here are the things we're willing to give up. And so when we met with the team before that community meeting, those were the things that we did. And because, you know, no one's going to negotiate with a room full of people. So you have to come up with these standards ahead of time, and then you charge that committee to do it. And the committee needs to understand you're not there to change the decision. You're there to say, this is what we want, and then bring that back, unless they give you what you want at that point, right? And with one exception, that's worked pretty well. There was one exception where the committee chair took people down another road and they made a decision different from what they were charged with. And I went ballistic, and they wanted to know why I went ballistic. You had no right to do that. You know, you don't do that. And I would like to think that two are not connected, but the general contractor for that development was putting a roof on his house, and about a month later, one had nothing to do with the other. But the idea of these meetings is that you bring forward what the community, when the community meets by itself. And another thing is you have to prepare the community to be able to have this sort of conversation, we could get the consensus that you're talking about. And so again, in Four Corners, we asked folks who in particular want to be on the Planning, Zoning, and Action Committee, and about 35 people agreed to do it. And we brought in, at the time it was the BRA, it was Public Facilities Department, they both changed their names since then, but they all came in and did trainings, right? And then we held trainings, and we had developers come in and hold trainings, so that people had an understanding of how this process worked, right? So you have to educate folks so they'll be prepared. So I think it is possible to have a democratic nonprofit, and we should always strive to do that, right? And so, and there have been times in meetings where the majority of the room wanted to go totally different from anything that I thought made sense. And I couldn't persuade them to change their minds, and that's it, because of the subject director did not give me authority to, to do anything differently. I mean, that would have been my job. And so, but the thing, that's one thing. The other thing, this thing about the foundations. And I totally agree with your book about the foundation. And I had hoped to see some of the people in some of the foundations here today. I want to hear because Claire mentioned that, and it's so true that folks don't want to speak up against foundations. My reputation is different. I'm surprised I still get money. But the fact is, I've had arguments with folks at Himes, with folks at Bar, with folks at some of these other foundations, because I have to be honest and I try to get other folks to come with me, but no one will, right? And so I think the foundations are well intentioned. I'm not sure that I would say that they run the governance, but they certainly do have a strong influence, because they have a strong influence on the nonprofit sector. And, but they create the inequality that you talk about in your book. And the Mattapan CDC is a clear example of that, to make your bottom line look good, instead of investing into an organization that had been around for a while and was doing good, you decided to pull out totally. And and it wasn't like, and the Boston Foundation in particular didn't have access to dollars or leverage dollars, And so, and this thing about supporting the ones that are already large and successful doesn't do well. I mean, we talk about equity, doesn't do well for the other organizations, even the one that's doing good, right? And the Fairmount Liners is certainly one of them. Grogan, he was the chair at the Boston Foundation at an event in Four Corners, a ribbon cutting, I believe it was. He announced that the Boston Foundation was investing $10 million in the Fairmount Corridor. And the mayor and everybody were clapped. And I looked at Mella, who was my organizers, and I said, how much do you think we're going to get? I said, we're going to have to fight for scraps, right? So now here's the organization that started the fight, that got the support of all the elected officials, convinced the MBTA to do this, brought out the Secretary of Transportation and the General Manager to Four Corners, right? This was, and convened all the community organizations along the corridor, including the CDCs, to form this coalition. And they helped leverage millions of dollars, in addition to the Boston Foundation, from the EPA and other, millions of dollars for the CDCs. And we got $45,000 a year. Wow. And I couldn't get them to go up, right? And so that creates inequality. And funders need to understand that they're harming what actually happened. And I'm telling Jeremy this, it created tension in the coalition that still exists today. And so it got to the point where Greater Four Corners, Mattapan United, Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and Project Right got together and said, we're going to band together and have our own coalition within the coalition. And we're going to seek funding ourselves, right? And it was clear, and we made rules to make sure that the CDCs could not dominate any meetings. And they're still in place today, right? And some of those tensions still exist. So we work well together, but it's not lovey-dovey, right? And so, but that's created, foundations help create that, right? But then the other is the large foundations, the larger community organizations are to be sensitive enough to say, let's make sure everybody gets something. They should not have turned their backs on MCDC, because they were like, okay, it weakened us as a coalition to have them dragging us down. And if they had their way, they probably got rid of Southwest Boston too at the time. Because I remember those conversations. But so Dorchester Bay and Carmen Square are bringing in millions of dollars. Those other two can't even get $100,000. And how is that helping the corridor? It's not helping the corridor. It's helping your little piece of the neighborhood. And when we talk about community, I think that we have to figure out what this means. We have to define a group of people some kind of way, and be able to establish those connections, because otherwise it's just all over the place. So I guess those are some of my initial thoughts, and particularly as I think about the statement that you made and about the book. But just one other last thing, I guess. Excuse me, you mentioned, Claire, that in spite of all the neighborhood organizations, there's still these problems that exist, right? And it's not until there is a real commitment from the government and the financial institutions to allow true equity in the communities that will ever change. So that structural racism and the fact that, no one wants to give up anything. And so it's okay if I can figure out how to give you something, as long as I don't have to take anything from me. And as long as that exists, it will never change. We'll never catch up. So that's my thoughts, my initial thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, I have some questions here, but I'd rather open it up to all of you for the last 15 minutes. Sir?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess when I was listening, I was trying to listen with an open mind. Organizer, doing it for 20 years. For me, hearing it, I was like, wow, it's so interesting to have someone else's eyesight on the work that's being carried forward, because I think juxtaposition, right? I've done national organizing with big financiers and fighting really big financial global shifting, right? And I think of corporations. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about that. We have this little tiny grassroots organization that's barely holding itself together with duct tape, right? And they're being questioned about if their community and are they impacting policy, right? But then we have corporations which have personhood, and they are literally funding and the destruction at a global level and impacting this one tiny community that is resisting the impact, right? Whether they're funded through a foundation or not, and often that money is funneled through foundations. So to me, it's where is that juxtaposition in this analysis of when we talk about structural inequity and structural racism? Where does that sit? Because to me, without this very clear structural analysis, or because then it becomes, because I could see a funder or somebody from this analysis being like, oh yeah, we gotta start this whole nonprofit. I read this book and can't make a decision, which is what we hear all the time, because government and systems that are run through corporate systems and structures don't want to slow down to be present with the due diligence it takes to take in all the information, sort through it, negotiate, compromise, come back to it, which takes longer than one meeting, 2 or 3 meetings. It also takes trust, and it depends on where that was a new organizer, new whatever, all those systems. And when often the system of the state system drops in something, people are responding, right? So I think that to me, it's what is that role? Where is that being seen? And how is it being elevated in this voice of recognizing, yes, community isn't always clear, particularly from the outside. But to me that matters less. I'm I don't care if it's clear to you or not. I know who's here, What I care about is, are they actually being able to be in the room? And does this perpetuate structural harm as evidence because there's not actually the structure being held accountable?
Want me to jump in? You want to start?
I mean, I agree with everything you just said, but one of my biggest frustrations is we expect small groups to handle big problems. It's just enormous scalar mismatch, right? We're trading something at the neighborhood level, at the Four Corners level, like who's actually holding the mortgages? Who owns the land, right? Like this is something so much bigger than any neighborhood. And so the sort of expectation that these grassroots groups, right? And no one funds organizing, right? Like to your point about there's an incredible vulnerability about no one funds organizing. Foundations don't like to do it. Government doesn't like to do it. There's a fear that it's too political, right? No one funds organizing. And that to me is one of the biggest frustrations, right? The fact that Greater Four Corners was able to create this huge public investment, it's a rare win of actually expanding government provision instead of having these processes be a retreat. But you just said aloud my biggest fear with putting this book out into the world, that it's going to be read as a reason to stop funding. That's my biggest own political fear. And I'm hoping that I wrote it carefully in a way that is holding funders accountable, because funders are making conversations smaller and smaller and not talking about the structural work that you're talking about. That we need to hold funders of both the private and the government side to recognize that they're using funding to avoid the difficult conversation, whether that's programs of reparations, whether that's universal basic income, whether it's expanding the public sector and public service provision of actually looking at school systems and public housing. That is a distraction. And those are the kind of conversations that I think social movements and grassroots groups put on the table, and the ways in which the politicization of funding has avoided. So you said my biggest fear, and I'm on the same page.
You're
with you.
welcome.
I was already having nightmares. It's just what I heard. No, I want that to be the message.
Following up on that, so if a funder were to pick up my book and say we should get rid of the nonprofits and not fund them, they already probably think that anyways. Tom Menino said in a meeting with me once, like if I could just take a bomb and blow up every nonprofit, I would. He didn't mean that literally. He meant it sort of figuratively. But if they were to do that, then it meant that they didn't get to the conclusion, because policy recommendation number 1 is that we should be having more nonprofits, not fewer. But this is actually potentially not necessarily something that you would necessarily agree with. I'm going to say it anyways. Is that the reason for that recommendation, and part of the issue I have, is that I think that there's an issue or like not great things when we have a system that's just a set of neighborhood gatekeepers across every neighborhood. It's great when it's Marvin, it's the Four Corners Action Coalition. It sounds great, but to use Marvin's words, I wouldn't say this, but you did, so I'm going to use it as an example. When CSNDC and Common Square is doing it, it's not as good as when you're doing your words, not mine. But that's what the system requires, and so the point. But like for the boss, and I'm also thinking just sort of bigger than necessarily being the advocate to sort of advocate for the communities of interest that you care about, although I'll say more about that in a second. But like if I'm the Boss Foundation, if I'm any foundation in the city or regionally, if I'm city government, state government, or even federal government, the nuances of what Marvin and the Four Corners Action Coalition were doing and what Gail is maybe not doing, or whomever in the CDC world, irrelevant to them. Because it's too hard to think about all of that. To them, you're the one in Four Corners, she's the one in Codman Square, there's one in Upham's Corner, and sort of so on, through their eyes. And that's what it was like working in City Hall. They saw this as like, it's indistinguishable. I know I didn't give it enough nuance in the book, I completely agree with you. But that's in part because the rest of the people are having less of that nuance. Some are, but most aren't. And so I think that's kind of an issue and kind of a problem. The system sort of lets that happen, and there's not the same kinds of checks and balances. I agree with what Marvin was saying earlier about there need to be more of a balance between those that have the formal systems of democratic accountability, the regular elections, with those that maybe do or don't have the informal ones that can be sort of the agitators pushing them, bringing them alongside. But that's not often how it works in practice, particularly again from the vantage point of sitting in City Hall, listening to them talk about the neighborhoods. And so I have some consternation about that as a sort of system of potential gatekeepers. On the community point, not to sort of keep going, but I'm just sort of going to riff on it. I mean, the thing that the basic thing that comes out that like was my frustration that led to this was like everyone's saying it, they're meaning something different, they're having conversations, and I'm saying one thing and talking this way, you're saying one thing and talking this way, we're using the same words, so it seems like we're having an interaction that's like comprehensible and makes sense, except when I say community, I mean residents of Four Corners, the Black residents, the Latino residents, the white residents, the gentrifiers and the old ones, I mean the geography. You mean, not only you specifically, but one might mean in this conversation, no, the marginalized people, not the people that are gentrifying the neighborhood or so on. But we're both talking about the community being empowered. And we're like, yeah, the community should be empowered. And we're like, yeah, the community should be empowered. I mean something completely different. And so I'm watching these things unfold and I'm like, we're saying everything different. Say what you mean. Because we're all just sort of using the word because we all agree, yeah, community is good. We all want that, right? But when we mean different things, then the actions we leave from this communication with this interaction where we say, yeah, community, great. And I go off to City Hall, or I go off to a foundation, or I go off to a community-based organization and then start to implement that stuff. We're doing completely different things because I'm thinking geography, or I'm thinking of marginalized groups specifically, or I'm just thinking about who showed up to the meeting. That's my community. Those are the people that matter. If you didn't show up to the meeting, sorry, that's the community process. Like you're not the community then for all intents and purposes. And so the language of community allows these things to unfold where we're no longer saying who's here, who's not here specifically, which residents are here and which aren't. Yes, obviously those conversations happen, they're important, but so often I would watch the community talk take place of concretely, which people, who's there. Because if we just use the language, then a gentrifier joining these neighborhoods is a community member as anyone else is on some definitions of community, but not others. And when we don't sort of establish who we mean when we say it, I think it leads for things to happen and enough people to say, yeah, we had a community process, the community showed up, the community recommended it, but the right people weren't there, but we didn't specify those people. People showed up, that's the community. And so without that specification allows the sort of wheels to keep churning without really being fully inclusive of specific people. So really that there isn't so much a get rid of community process. It's more like community process needs to be specific about which people and then have design that gets those people to be participating specifically without identifying it and defining it. You sort of lose that. Last thing, because I know I'm rambling. That said, I'm preaching from this vantage point as not a community organizer. If I was a community organizer, I might say, bullshit, this is ridiculous. Community has moral value. When I talk about organizing the community and use that language, that is how I get funders, that's how I persuade people, that's how I get people interested in. The moral value that you're saying and dismissing as being confusing and not specific enough is actually my bread and butter. For how I elevate the things I'm saying. And so I'm not necessarily certain that I would take a recommendation from there and actually implement it in community organizing practice. I'm thinking more so in some ways from a policy level perspective of thinking not just about the organizers, but everyone else as well who's also using that language. Sorry for the spiel.
I'll talk to you later.
I know, I'm sure you will.
I am also part of Marvin's team, and I think that it would be a useful piece and more than a nuance to separate out service providing nonprofits from political organizing voice nonprofits. And the fact they were bundled together, I think creates some confusion in the analysis. I think the other thing that we see in the service providing nonprofits, because of this 60-year history that your book described in a very interesting way, and in the creation of a fairly compromised setting, which is what we have now, is that they speak to the needs that they represent, they speak to their organizational maintenance, and so they actually push out the voice of actual people who have multiple needs. And so it's a complicated setting that is not well served by bundling these different types of, IRS tax-based nonprofits together, because they're quite different. And I guess that's the piece and I'm appreciative of saying that City Hall bundles them together, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But in an analysis of it, to not have Marvin Martin, who deserves a last name in this conversation, be able to say that he's an organizer who does not provide services and very specifically negotiated with the service providing organizations in the area for who would provide services and who would do the organizing. I think that's an important element of this.
I think you're completely right. We have such a poverty of language that we say the nonprofit sector, and that includes everything from big universities to tiny PTAs that don't even have an office space, right? I teach about nonprofits and I say, like, it's just a tax category. I'm like, it's really boring. It's the IRS. But I completely agree. We don't always have the specificity that we need when we have these conversations about organizers, about social service providers, and how that gets shaped by funding, by pressures, by organizers. Yeah, I'm very much on board with that.
I agree too.
Yes.
Thank you for your comments. I consulted with some of these organizations that you give community in quote outreach. If you were advising the Wu administration on how you might coordinate some of these kind of pillars of the community, every time I say community now, I'm gonna
If I've done my job well.
not me.
I'll take it.
The foundation, the city government, the financial institutions, corporations, if you were advising the Wu administration on how you heard these cats, what would some of your, what would you advise? Anyone on the phone?
Jeez.
They say it's a new day at City Hall, right? I wonder. Yeah.
Well, but I don't, yeah, I mean, I don't know how you guys heard me, cats. I don't know how you would get them together. I think that the Wu administration, and we understand the Wu administration still learning their way, so we have to understand that. But the one good thing is, she did not come in beholden to developers, which our last two mayors have. And that helped shape a lot of politics that came out. So there's a more of a blank slate, so to say. It's never totally blank, but you know, it's more clay to work with. But I think understanding or being able to build the bridges between community and these institutions, and have these institutions understand that understand the inequality of their power in these conversations, and that maybe they should come into these conversations and just shut up and just listen.
Yeah, because everybody's talking about equity, but
You know,
a lot of it is
a lot of,
performative.
people don't understand. You can't be, you have these institutions who, some of the large hospitals and all these other financial institutions who are used to having their way, right? And they're not gonna give that up easily, and they don't know any other way. And so it's really being able to the mayor and the city doesn't have a lot of leverage, which we need to understand that too with some of these institutions, right? They can't make them do stuff, but they can be very persuasive, because if you want to do business here, sooner or later you got to come to the city for something.
That's right.
So I think the city has to be able to push through this, have to have the CEOs and folks to understand that they are no better, no more powerful than anyone else in this city. And there needs to be equal conversation. And what is it that you can do for these folks? And in a real term. But it really takes, this is again about if you're going to make that real commitment, otherwise nothing's going to change. Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I do two quick ones?
Quick.
Very fast. One, use some of that muscle, push private funders to be giving more money toward the places that may not show success, where your money may just go into a pit. you don't know if it's going to be successful, to not be selecting on where you fund based on where you think there's going to be the most success. I
Because
think
the
it marks
Mattapan
inequity.
CEC
Great
is,
example
has
of that.
come back.
Uh,
They're on their way back.
And they
yeah.
should have been not left in 2011, 2012. In that room, they said no. Second, abolish public meetings as we know them, as we know them, not
even on Zoom.
as we know them. And I think our sort of co-panelists and organizers would maybe agree, but as we know them, to change the focus on getting the community to come together and come up with a thing, to rather about ways that we can get the most amount of information all on the table and then hash it out and maybe disagree. Sometimes it may be that community members may have an idea, as you had sort of alluded to before, that isn't that good, and maybe that's not the right way to go forward. I think those conversations don't happen when we resort to community meetings as a singular sort of voice. I think more sort of contestation to really hash out some of these issues.
And to your point, there was a community meeting during the Patrick administration where they wanted to do, they wanted to change the streetscape of Warren Street, and the neighborhood was up in arms, the neighborhood along Warren Street was up in arms, and the disruption, and a lot of people turned out. They had it at Washington Square Park. And the governor was there, and people, it was $135 million project. And the governor said, if you do not want this in your neighborhood, then it's not gonna happen. And it didn't happen. They hashed it out, and that was the end of that, yeah.
I got my policy recommendations.
Sure.
Fund community organizing, building people power is the only way to actually change things, and use the levers of policy. The grant making and one-off solutions are not going to actually do much at the structural level. So thinking about reinvesting in public institutions at a much bigger scale than one-off projects, neighborhood by neighborhood.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today, and thank you to our excellent panelists with these excellent books.